This is why skipping detention might be a good idea. When I was in high school, I slacked off a lot. My junior year, my math teacher was pretty upset by this. Once during a parent-teacher meeting, he told my mom that I wasn't doing as well as I could and called me lazy. My mom agreed and stated that she wouldn't blame him if he pushed and punished me to work harder. From this day on, he did exactly that, always questioning me before anyone else and always sat next to me during exercises. This is when my classmates started realizing that he was a little obsessed with me and started teasing me about it. Right before Christmas break, he threw us a surprise party with chocolates and mock champagne. He poured me an extra glass and congratulated me for doing better. I drank the first glass he gave me, but not the second because I'm diabetic and had already had too much chocolate. During the next class, I felt extremely sick and almost fainted. I spent the rest of the day in the nurse's office and chalked it up to eating too much candy. A few weeks later, I failed a math test. He became extremely angry and yelled at me in front of everyone. The look in his eyes chilled me and I cried. He gave me detention but scheduled it hours later than the usual time and said he would personally be there as well. When I showed up, it was getting dark already and I noticed I was the only student there. Something felt off and a feeling deep inside my gut was pushing me to skip. Right when I decided to skip, I look over and see him walking towards me. As he walked towards me, I was getting nervous. I told him that I had an emergency and I had to go, but I would email the school and reschedule later. Right after this, I ran off. As I was running away, he yelled at me and told me that I had to obey him and come to detention or he'd call my parents. At this moment, I didn't care. The feeling in my gut kept growing, so I sprinted to the bus and went home. I was afraid that he'd call my parents, but my parents greeted me normally when I got home, so I assumed he didn't. The next day, I was expecting to get an earful, but he wasn't there, and as weeks passed, he never came back. Then a shrink came to our class and asked if he'd like to talk about our math teacher, but no one knew why. Fast forward a few years later when I became a teacher and started chatting with my coworker. I mentioned his name, speaking to her about my weird, bizarre teacher and how I skipped attention. That's when one of the oldest workers there went pale hearing his name. It turns out a few days after I skipped attention, my math teacher was arrested for downloading child you-know-what from the dark web. He also had tons of snuff videos doing terrible things to children and teens. Now I always wonder what would have happened if I hadn't followed my gut instincts and stayed for detention that day with just me and him in that classroom. How my neighbors were killed and we all heard. I live in a middle to low class neighborhood in the Caribbean. It's a quiet place where nothing happens. It's the type of place that people go to retire and sip pina coladas all day. However, a few houses next to mine lived a family that was not like the rest. They had the biggest house on the street and lived luxuriously. Their kids would play with me, especially the smallest girl we nicknamed Tiny. Tiny was my best friend and she was always at my house. On Tiny's birthday, her parents threw a giant party for her and all of the neighborhood kids were invited. They had bouncy houses, water slides, and everything a kid would want to play with, but my parents wouldn't let me go. I never knew why. I suppose it was because my mom didn't know her mom. After the birthday, things went back to normal, and one day we were all playing and talking about what our parents did for work. We asked Tiny and her siblings, but none of them knew what they did except that their dad traveled a lot and was always at meetings. I didn't pay much attention and we all continued on with our day. One night, we were playing on the street when we started hearing loud pops and screams coming from Tiny's house. I will never forget that day. The neighbors, including my mom, came out rushing us inside yelling that it was gunshots. She locked us inside the house and I couldn't believe what happened next. After hearing gunshots, we stayed locked in my house while the next door neighbor, who was a cop, ran towards Tiny's place. Then we saw a black man rushing down the street trying to get away. Tiny and her siblings wanted to check what was going on, but everyone forbade them to go. All I remember was a bunch of cops and ambulances a few minutes later, and after that day, I never saw Tiny or her siblings again. For a couple months, the house sat empty, but black vans and strange men kept coming into the neighborhood. They went door to door asking for any information about the man and his children. No one in the neighborhood spoke about it, and as years passed, the story faded away. Now that I'm grown up, I asked my neighbor, the cop, what went down that night. He said that night, Tiny's dad got a gun emptied in his skull and his wife was gravely wounded, but she survived. Apparently, he was a drug lord that was going to make a deal with the police to turn in rival gangs and some other people to the cops. The men in the van that were going door to door wanted to know where his kids and wife were to also shut them up. Tiny's oldest brother was found dead in a neighboring town, his car set ablaze. Tiny and her siblings are now living in other countries under witness protection programs. I just hope wherever she is, she's doing okay and her family got the help that they needed. Hey, something's off with the new guy. I had taken a job as a security guard at a plant that made locks. I worked from 7:30 p.m. till 3:30 a.m. and there was always two of us. After working there 6 months, I saved enough to move and serve my notice. A new hire was brought in to fill my spot. He was a soft-spoken man named Calvin. He worked all hours as part of his training, and at night he'd shadow me or my coworker Amira. Amira and I were 18 years old while Calvin was a decade older. He was quiet and polite, but something seemed to be missing. There's a spark that genuinely nice people seem to have, and he didn't possess it. At first, I thought he was just awkward, but that thought quickly changed. One night during his first week, he went on rounds with Amira. When they returned to the office, I immediately knew something was wrong. Amira was normally talkative, but she was dead silent, and when Calvin went to the restroom, I asked her what's going on. On their rounds that night, during the part of the plant that's the darkest, she was walking up the stairs when she turned around and he was right on her. She backed against the railing and he leaned in towards her, his face nearly touching hers. He flirted in a low voice, and when she mentioned his wedding band, he said it would be over soon. The next night came and went, but Calvin never showed up. A couple of days later, we found out the chilling reason why. He was off with the new guy. A couple of days later, when I came into work, Amira was freaking out. She had found out the reason reason that Calvin hadn't been to work the last week. He had been arrested for murdering his wife. In August, he had reported her missing and investigators found luggage filled with her belongings in a dumpster near a hotel that Calvin previously worked at. She was missing for months until they found a shoe in a pond that led to finding her body in November. Her body had been dismembered, burned, and placed in a pond piece by piece. The pond was located just less than a mile from where we worked. That night, Amir called the jail just to make sure that they were still holding him. Based on the time frame, he had already killed his wife months before he started working with us. It took investigators 8 months before they could charge him with the murder. He was convicted and served 20 years and 5 months. He was released on August 5th, 2015. His wife's name was Viola and she was only 29 years old. Listen to your gut. When I was 13, my family and I were headed home from night church service. It was my mom, me, and my 2 siblings. The road we were driving on was in the country and it was late at night, so there were no lights and no one else on the road. As we were coming up on our turn, a car suddenly comes swerving from our turning spot. They were turning so fast that they came into our lane and almost crashed into us. My mom quickly swerved as they tried to get back into their lane. Unfortunately, they overcorrected and flipped their car, landing on the driver's side door in a ditch. My mom hit her brakes and jumps out the car to go help the other driver. She gets about 3 steps away from our car, but then stops dead in her tracks. My siblings and I were watching her from the back window and wondering why she wasn't going to help the person. That's when he starts yelling for help and my mom starts to move to help him, but for some reason she stops again in the center of the road. Another car flies behind us and the guy doesn't hesitate to jump out and go help. The man pries open the passenger door so the guy trapped inside can get out. As the man crawls out, he instantly gets into a frog-like crouching position on top of the car. He has this insane look on his face and launches himself off of the car, hitting the guy who helped him. Then he turns his gaze in our direction and starts sprinting towards us. As he's sprinting towards our car, my mom is sprinting towards us as well. He must have known he wouldn't get there before her because he changed directions and went to the other car. My mom jumps in and locks the doors as the man hijacks the car behind ours, almost hitting us as he takes off. The guy who was just carjacked runs to my mom's window and is screaming at her to call 911 because his phone and his girlfriend were in the car that just took off. I quickly dialed it on my phone and handed it to her. As she's talking to the operator, we hear a woman scream down the road. The man takes off running and returns a few minutes later with a severely scraped up woman in his arms. The girlfriend told us that the man noticed her in the car and was trying to hit her and finally pushed her out going 60 miles per hour. When the police arrived, they informed my mom that the man had shot and killed someone behind an apartment complex and was trying to get away. Later that night after we got home, I talked to my mom and asked her why she stopped running to the car earlier. She said she had such a strong feeling that she should stay in the car with us that it was almost like she could hear it. When she heard him yell and started to go over to help, the same feeling overtook her. Luckily, that man was caught later that night trying to steal a new car. But to this day, I wonder what would have happened if my mom hadn't listened to her gut feeling. Drugs. I'm a nurse in a busy hospital and I work in urgent care. One night, a guy got brought in and he was really messed up on all kinds of drugs. He was really sick, but after a few hours, he was conscious and started acting crazy and getting violent. We were forced to secure him to the bed with soft restraints and give him something to calm him down. He accused us of being aliens and kept demanding that we take him back to Earth. I informed him that he is indeed still on Earth and we're just trying to help him, but he kept insisting that he needed to escape. As I was coming back into the room to give him something to calm down, he managed to remove all soft restraints and began ripping out all of his IVs. Then he got up from the bed, completely naked and covered in blood, and began to run out of the hospital room. He ran out into the hallway as we chased after him and yelled at him to stop. We were on the 2nd floor and he ran to the elevator and pushed the call button vigorously. As we got closer to him, he freaked out and proceeded to the railing looking down at the lobby of the 1st floor. He got on top of the railing and said, "You'll never catch me alive, I won't be your test subject," and jumped. I'll never forget the sound his body made when it hit the ground or the screams of the nurses. To my surprise, he got up and started limping towards the exit, flipping us off from the hospital lobby, hysterically laughing. After that, I never saw him again. Should be careful who you swipe right on. During those 2 weeks, I didn't have anything. I had to wear the same clothes over and over or wear his clothes. Apparently, one of my friends noticed that I wasn't replying, so they messaged me on Twitter. Unfortunately, I was in the shower and he had gone through my phone and deleted the messages. Luckily, I was starting school, so I told him once again that I had to go. He did the same thing, insisting on taking me to school and waiting outside of my class. I left the classroom through the back door 15 minutes early and ran home. I was so scared that he would see me and follow me. He kept showing up at my house, so I didn't go outside for a week for any reason. Eventually, he went away. 2 months later, I moved across the country with my friend and everything was going great, until I got a text from an unknown number that just said, "I'm here now." When I asked who it was, he told me it was him and that he had moved 30 minutes away from me. He never came to find me in person, but he would text me all the time, and when I blocked him, he would just get a new phone number. This went on for about 2 years and I ignored him the entire time. It's now been a year since I've heard from him and I also moved back. I told my mom what had happened and she tracked him down and saw that he also moved back. Now I'm always careful who I match with.